Okay, so Joya, over to you. And I will now share the screen. But do please, everybody, keep your keep your camera on, but your mic off, so that we don't get any feedback.
Thanks very much, David. I'm just going to start straight away because I'm conscious that some people have to leave before at exactly 6 o'clock. So I'm not going to recapitulate the lectures as I did last week, and I hope I'll say enough about them in the course of this lecture so that people who missed out on last week's lecture will still pick up enough of what I said for this to make sense. Okay, so by the end of 1948 then, all Indian states had become part of the larger body politic, whether by force, in case of Hyderabad and Junagadh, or by accession. The States Ministry, with V.P. Menon as its secretary, could now take stock. It could draw back the curtain and survey the so-called princely order. As Yakub Bangash from the audience pointed out last week, no such order existed, despite the British efforts to create one. Some states existed in the sense I tried to describe last week and had substantial authority and legitimacy, which they had garnered by cleaving to certain idioms of rule, while others were ragtag zamandaris, which had not. So what did Menon do? Well, given the Anglo-Indian political legal position he was coming from, he did what appeared to him to be the obvious thing. He sought to force them into an order. By asking B.N. Rao, the draftsman of India's constitution, to draft a common constitution for all the states side by side. Rao completed this more or less at the same time as he completed the drafting of the Constitution of India. Although I quote Menon, his white paper, rapid developments on the ground required amendments to be inserted until the very last minute before its adoption on Republic Day in 1950. Note, the very meaning of Republic Day has a deeper significance if viewed from this perspective. Scholars such as Sri Rupa Roy have done some very fine work on the banal enactment of nationalism by Indians routinely engaged in activities after independence, such as saluting the flag and whatever, Independence Day. But I suggest that Republic Day was anything but banal. Its very extravagance, its pastiche of floats representing all of India's authentic cultures, in combination by its display of hard power, all those tanks and, infantry and cavalry regiments and MiG fighter jets and other fighter jets flying by, showed it to be a very different kind of state from the one it had absorbed, and it was deliberately curated as such. Coming back to what happened to the states at this time, was that Menon bundled the small states into larger units. Thus the Punjab states, David, could I have the next slide, please? Thus the Punjab states, as well as the hill states, which we now think of as Himachal Pradesh. David, could I have the next slide, please? Thanks. Became PEPSU, the Patiala and East Punjab States Union. The small Afghan and Rajput states in the Rajputana region became Rajasthan, the Rajasthan Union, and so on. So for a long period of time in the early 1950s, this was, if you like, an agglomeration of states, which included many, many, many smaller states into larger ones. Geographically speaking then, whereas you previously had one Hyderabad, a large state which had accounted for, I remind you, almost a third of the population of the old states put together, which had now been decapitated by military rule, in effect, the Indian state had created several large states. David, could you show us the next slides, please? Just slowly. So these are the stamps issued by these large states. So you can see that they're not just lying down and folding in terms of their claims to certain kinds of legitimacy and authority. These are not just any old stamps with a tractor on them or whatever that we're used to seeing. They don't have Mahatma Gandhi on the front. They're claiming their dynastic authority. If we move to the next one. These are stamps issued by the new agglomerations. Madhya Bharat shows the image of a temple, again, showing the association of rulership with sublime qualities. And Saurashtra, you'll see, and it's important, shows the figure of a king, but also you can see that the role of the Gujarati script on the language, on the stamp itself. So bear that in mind. So, as for the constitutional status of the heads of these new agglomerations, instead of being called chief ministers, they were called Raj Pramukhs, or first among kings. But in order to decide who was first, they used the old British ranking system, of course. As Raj Chandavarkar so percipiently showed, colonial customs of governance barely changed in large areas of state functioning, and this formed at least part of India's post-colonial predicament. As for these Raj Pramukhs, as they were now styled, and the Up Rajas beneath them, they still enjoyed large latitude, for the moment at least, over their internal affairs, customs duties, and privy purses. In due course, Anglo-Indian law would be imposed upon them, so they would lose their vital role as dispensers of justice and thereby as upholders of equipoise, which I've suggested was such a large part of their sense of their duty of kingship. Later still, they would lose their customs revenues, which had been their chief source of income, although the state made up a tiny part of the shortfall. And finally, as every schoolgirl amongst us knows, at least those who are amongst us who've been brought up in Indian schools, they lost their privy purses in 1971. These privy purses had previously paid for the upkeep of palaces, of households, servitors, armed bodyguards, cooks, cleaners, as well as courtly style and patronage networks, as well as pensions. Now, the Indian state tried to replace these, the latter part, the patronage networks, with the sum of 500,000 rupees for each of these large agglomerations. Now, I just ask you to consider the amount that sum was 500,000, when we remember that at the end of Hyderabad's existence as a princely state, it was spending 1.25 crore rupees just on the rehabilitation of refugees in its camps. So you get an idea of the shrinkage of the actual monetary capacity, fiscal capacity of these states. In this context, they struggled to remain relevant. But the new constitution allowed them 2 areas in which they could do so. The new regime, or the conquering power, as one Hyderabadi petitioner described the Indian state, allowed them 2 areas in which they could do so. The first was charitable works. Oops. The second was religious affairs. Oops, again. On the first one, India was hamstrung by its own constitution, which gave every citizen freedom of religion. On the second, it was a more complex situation where India was overburdened, as it saw itself, with refugees that it had to look after. I was also concerned with undue expenditure of the rupee, which was at this period in time undergoing, causing, as it was believed, inflationary pressures in the economy. So it was happy just to turn a blind eye for the states to spend monies in their own currencies and get on with it. Now, of course, these were matters in which the Rani Sahibas, Nizams, Nawabs, Maharajas had developed to a fine art, as I tried to show in my previous lecture. So they now plunged into the territory of charity by continuing what they had done all along, albeit with adjustments to the changing trends of accelerating modernity. They built hospitals, dispensaries, and schools. The Maharani Gayatri Devi School for Girls was perhaps the most iconic project of the times. Baroda, of course, went a step further. Baroda was always kind of a bit of a leader in this area. The kingdom had a long engagement with the development of higher education, as Manu Bhagwan has shown. And during this era, the Maharaja developed the University of Baroda into a world-class institution. Two of my former PhD students took their first degrees there, as did many friends. And they've gone on to glittering careers. If you're out there watching, I can see one of you is, hi. And I hope your university's history is a bit clearer in this context. Indore ramped up its Ahilyabai charities, which had been set up in the previous era of famine. Baroda went further than this. Maharaja Gaikwad created a trust, a modern legal body based on English law, which had a corpus, had a body of trustees, and a corpus, which is again an idea which comes from British law, of 20 million rupees to create, I quote, public works of public utility in the rural areas. There is some mention, although there's not much clarity, of ambitious experiments in agrarian reform, apparently introducing double cropping by the creation of new irrigation canals in the rural areas. Again, the context has to be borne in mind. This is a period in which India is concerned about food shortages, grain dependencies, particularly on the United States, and the Grow More Food campaign is well underway. And so Baroda wants to be not just seen to be a follower, but as a leader in this project. It's well known, because Amartya Sen has made it well known, that there were no major famines in independent India. But local ones continued, and the need for relief never let up in a region flooded with refugees and the local impoverished. The Scindias had already created the Ganga Jali Fund before midnight for grave emergencies such as famine, and now H.H. Gwalior, or the Raj Pramukh of Madhya Bharat, had the sole authority to administer it. And so they basically now began to pump in more resources, or such resources as they had, they diverted into these two channels, or these two areas of authority that had been left to them. Meanwhile, engagement with what I call intimate relief continued well into the 2000s. I've mentioned before the tiny Shia state of Mahmudabad on the outskirts of Lucknow. As a professor at Cambridge and later as the director of the Center of South Asian Studies, I got to know two of its sahibzadas as students. Later, the center became involved in a large project, spanned India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, to save South Asian manuscript collections in situ. And its archivist, Dr. Kevin Greenbank, turned back at the fort, the Mahmudabad fort, for a preliminary encounter with its extraordinarily rich manuscript collection. But staying at the fort or palace for a few days, he observed a process that seemed entirely strange to him. As he reported it to me, every day that he was there, the Raja in the morning for 2 or 3 hours would present himself to the people, and they would come to him for relief. Some of them needed wheelchairs or crutches or bandages or salves or other forms of medical assistance or just assistance, small amounts of money, which make huge differences, which make huge difference to the quality of life of a debilitated person. And here I speak as one. But obviously cost far less than famine relief. I imagine that for them, the very fact that he had given it to them personally in an intimate act of commiseration would have made the object itself, the wheelchair, say, or the crutch, more meaningful to them. Kevin also recalls, again with a certain degree of confusion, that there were rooms full of wheelchairs and crutches and so on stored in the palace, and he couldn't quite get his head around the fact that along with these manuscripts, there were all these other objects, obviously for dispersal to the hitherto subjects and still in some subjects. And of course, the other area in which the new Raj Pramukhs and their cohorts invested heavily was in the sphere of sublime sovereignty. Last week, I showed you a few slides of recent pandemic era Ramleelas at Ramnagar. David, could you show us the next slide, please? And the longest in the world, presided over the former Maharaja of Banaras, who is still addressed as such. If we could go back to the, yeah. This is presided over, it's called the Maharaja of Banaras's Ramleela at Ramnagar to this day, even though there is no Maharaja and there is no such place as Banaras anymore, but it's still referred to in that way. It's the longest Ramleela in the world, lasting 31 days. But instead of focusing, as I did last week, on the actual players in the Ramleela, the children representing the Ram and Sita, and also the Ramayani chanter in the background, I want you to look at this crowd, the picture of the crowd, extending as far as the eye can see. And this is, if you like, in 2020 during COVID. The next one, David, shows the Dasara in Bangalore. Last week, I asked you to focus on the Maharaja Wadeyar in procession on an elephant in his palanquin with the fly whisks and all the flags and so on that were behind him. This week, I want you to focus on the crowds. Now, of course, these crowds are dissimilar in that the Maharaja is processing along a main road, and so the crowds would be stretching way, way, way beyond him, right? Again, this is from 2020. So not so long ago then. Who are these people? I think many of them are modern subjects. They are novel kinds of subjects, to be sure, but who have learnt how to negotiate between subjecthood, citizenship, and democracy in ways I will discuss below, but still subjects who suggest how subjecthood has had an afterlife in our now extremely fragile democracy. I can't answer for sure, and you could turn this back on me and say, come on, Joya, crowds will gather to watch any spectacle in India. And I'll have to say, sure, that's true. But this number, to be honest, I haven't seen this number gather to watch any old spectacle. I would also, if you were sitting with me across the table and we were just having a debate over a glass of wine or a cup of coffee, I would refer you back to Aya Ikegama's fine historical anthropology of Dasara in Mysore, Bangalore. What she shows is that even as the crowds, who are mainly male, have a look carefully, jostled to get a view, darshan, of the Maharaja as he processes through the city, the women of the city placed with what she described as dolls, not idols. These are dolls, regular dolls that you could buy in the market, that they dress up to represent Mahishasura, the demon, and Chamundeshwari, the regional tutelary deity, and manipulate them to achieve the dharmic outcome and the triumph of the tutelary deity over the demon. And after this, they reenact this process, and after that, they pray for the good well-being and safety and security, not only of the dynasty, but also of the general state of former state of Mysore, now Bangalore. The light of the public spectacle then is being mirrored in the private space of the household. And it suggests that an alchemy is at work, and that during these moments of festival, at least, citizens of the IT hub of Bangalore could, for a while, also be subjects of the Vodiyars. It seems that they found no incongruity in so being. So far, though, I focused on states that acceded with no resistance. That leaves out states that were crushed, whose rulers were toppled or driven into exile. For reasons of time, I will restrict myself to Hyderabad. There, the changes were most jagged, most abrupt, and far more violent than anything that happened elsewhere, with the exception of Kashmir. That's a story. Kashmir, of course, is a story for another time and for another lecture series, if not more. I'll also focus on Hyderabad because it was so large. Let me remind you that its population represented 1 in 3 of all state subjects. It was also, well, so much larger than life. Those of you who've stuck with this series will recall that Hyderabad had experienced huge refugee influxes, emigrations, and internal migrations of people after midnight. Our best estimate is that 27,000 to 40,000 people died during and after Operation Polo, as India's military intervention was codenamed. Let me remind you that the Nizam had surrendered on day 1, so the scale of violence is so disproportionate that historians who now know this fact have been left astounded. Just to give you a sense of the scale of the violence, this is 10 times as many who died in the Great Calcutta killing, and just under half of those who died in partition the North. If any people were in need of relief then, it was the people of Hyderabad. And of course, the great majority of people who were attacked, killed, and savaged and driven out of their homes after Operation Polo were Muslims. Hyderabad came in for special treatment, though. The Nizam wasn't allowed to become a Raj Pramukh along with the other states. Oh no. Hyderabad was first run under a form of military rule by Major General Chaudhry, the man who had led Operation Polo. Think about that. I have found his style in the letters that I've read by him obnoxious in the extreme. But having read Taylor Sherman's work on the subject, it would seem that the chief minister I say in quotes because no chief minister at this stage was elected. The first elections were held in 1950. Was worse. Dogmatically secular in the Western sense, he had a rigid belief in the separation of the secular state from religious institutions and their patronage, and indeed the patronage of persons. So he kind of mixed up the idea of relief with the patronage of persons. Between the two men, Hyderabad's finely woven local, national, and global ties of patronage were suddenly and abruptly frozen. They were, it hardly needs to be said, particularly harsh on Muslims, in part because many, but by no means all, the Nizam's causes had promoted aspects of Muslim culture or worship, but because they were fuglemen of the Hindu majoritarianism that had begun to flower in India after independence. So to whom could pensioners appeal, Muslim pensioners appeal? To whom could they and the distressed and the despairing address petitions for justice that were the form of politics that they best understood? Some of these petitions survive for Hyderabad. There are also many from Junagadh, but I won't impose them on you today. You will not be surprised to learn that a great many had to do with relief and with the restitution of pensions and patronage. Today, though, I'm going to focus on the ones that had to do with relief, of which there are a great number. Now, it's interesting to see what happens. To begin with, it would seem the pensioners or the petitioners wrote to everybody. They didn't quite know. Nizam is gone. So who to write to? They're not really sure who to approach in this new context. So they wrote to everybody. They wrote to VELLODI himself. They wrote to Patel in Delhi, to Nehru, to Syed Mahmood, the long-serving secretary of the Congress Party, and also to Maulana Azad. In many of the petitions that I've seen in the files, the same letter is addressed to all of these men, right? One petitioner, Abdul Qadir, thus wrote to VELLODI about a mosque destruction case. David, could we have the next slide, please? And if you can just read that slide, it's really very, very interesting. Now, Abdul Qadir, the author of this petition, is not just any old person. He's the president of the JAMIAT ULEMA of Hyderabad. And the JAMIAT was, certainly at this time, a very well-regarded institution in Congress circles, partly because it had been nationalist in ways that the Congress understood, and particularly because it had taken a stance against Pakistan. So this petition, one would have thought, would have carried a certain degree of weight. But I'd like to draw your attention to other aspects of this petition. First, Abdul Qadir clearly knows that it is Government of India policy to restore defaced shrines and temples to their owners or the community that maintains their worship and looks after them. This was government policy. He knows, second, that colonial modern governmentality and potential secular Raj will pursue facts in a rational manner through commissions of inquiry. There were many commissions of inquiry ongoing at this time, that it will seek the evidence and try to weigh and arrive at, with reason, a conclusion based on truth. Thus, he's already writing as an informed member of the public. I use the word as in its Hindi sense, as the janta or the citizenry, yet in the forms and tropes of subjecthood. So you can already see the ways in which the language of citizenship and the tropes of subjecthood are intertwining in these petitions. But he meets with curtness. And petitioners then tend to turn after this point to other channels, the press and the Jamiat Ulema. The Jamiat collects petitions by the handful. You know, shovelfuls of such petitions, but basically they meet with no success. And so they turn to the press. David, could we have the next slide? New Urdu language papers come into being. Now, this is one that Taylor Sherman references. This is a remarkable petition. It's rather like an open letter addressed to Sardar Patel in a journal that is brand new called MAMLEKAT. And look at the language. A defeated nation is addressing its conqueror. And look at what he's saying. We want to rehabilitate Muslims from the economic point of view, i.e. relief, and to make good their present destruction to some extent. Please give us a little rehabilitation. In the political field, we don't want anything. Do what you want. Give Hyderabad to whoever you like. So actually making few claims of citizenship or right to be reinstated in government in any way. But yes, relief. Yes, relief. They will go on and on demanding relief because this is how they understand what good governments do. Now, if you remember what I said about the Nizam's relief work, I mean, of course, Sardar Patel says, ha, and probably throws it into the bin. If you remember what I said about the Nizam's relief works, they would have experienced this as an alarming failure of state. But here's what's interesting. The campaign that begins in the Hyderabadi media for relief and the rehabilitation of Muslims, which never succeeds to the slightest extent, begins to be taken up by regional language and Urdu presses in other parts of the country where Muslims have suffered hugely during partition. And we all know from the work of Francis Robinson and many, many others, this importance of the circulation of vernacular language newspapers. I know from my work on Bengal, for instance, that there are a huge number of papers that begin to address this issue about the lack of relief for Muslims who have suffered during partition, in contrast with the relief, however gratuitous it was, that was being given to Hindus. And I have also, during my studies of Bengal a lifetime ago, shown that the first round of non-Congress independent Muslim ministers in Bengal, the likes of Ghani Khan Chaudhry, who had a single cause, was relief and rehabilitation of Muslim displacees, rose from regional to from local to regional and then national prominence. This was in the spoils of partition. Here's a case of perhaps two things going on. Watching relief, dreadful though it was for Hindus being doled out and nothing for them, and also hearing before this from the Hyderabadi siyasat, which was widely circulated, and the JAMIAT about the disaster that had befallen Muslims in Hyderabad. So what I'm trying to suggest is that what's happened to Hyderabad is not limited to Hyderabad. It begins to have ripple effects throughout the country, and people begin to pick up themes from Hyderabad and make them their own in other parts of the country. Okay, so basically nothing is happening in terms of these strategies for petition. So what do they do next? As Sherman shows, and other work corroborates, indeed my own work in archive corroborates, the man that they petitioned after this was Nehru himself. Why might this be the case, and what are its implications? Julie Stevens has showed in her superb work, I quote, that petitioners invoke intimate ties. If Nehru received these petitions, like in bulk, he did so, no doubt, because he had visited Hyderabad. while falling in love with the Hyderabadi Padmaja Naidu, the poet Sarojini Naidu's daughter. He had fallen in love with the idea of Hyderabad and its unique culture, indeed its civilization. His public speeches in the city had been heavy with affect. He said in a public speech, "My heart is soft." He spoke of the onrush of emotion that overwhelmed him when he visited the city. Of course, Hyderabadis knew that Nehru had opposed Operation Polo while Sardar Patel had insisted upon it, but no doubt they were as taken aback as I was by this extraordinary public display of feeling. And I can assure you that when he came to Bengal after independence, there was no such moment where he says, "Oh, I feel terrible about all the Bengalis who've died." This was something he performed in Hyderabad. So petitioners began to write to him. So here's an example of one petitioner from Akbar Ali Khan to Nehru. David, could you have the next slide, please? So he's a Congress candidate of 1952, the first general elections in India. And like, as I said, Ghani Khan Chaudhry and others, the theme on which he stands is Muslim rehabilitation. But note what he's doing in this letter. It is a matter of democracy, he says. Note how he is constructing a version of minority citizenship. Muslim citizens have not obtained equal rights. He's using the language of rights, a language of citizenship, but the fact of unequal citizenship. And he's also invoking a language of affect. Muslims feel anxious. As Sherman shows, this feeling of anxiety resonates in Hyderabad through the entire period. And then notes what he does. He compares victims of violence to those of a natural disaster like famine, and argues that democratic principles require that Muslims of violence should be given special consideration in comparison with others. So he is trying once again to do this kind of mixing of arguments that pertained or languages that pertained in the old regime with the language of citizenship and rights and democracy. And, he's a Congress candidate. And of course, will go on to win the election. Now, Nehru's response to these general petitions, as well as the particular ones for the retention of pensions and patronage, was most interesting. Taylor Sherman has described it as ad hoc and authoritarian, in that he picked and chose particular high-profile projects that took his fancy and restored them to the status quo ante, so that, for instance, the government of India, which had previously frozen the salary of the Imam of the Jama Masjid of Delhi, now began once again to pay his 320 rupees per month. But this did not necessarily extend to lesser Maulvis and Imams who had been supported by the Nizam. Likewise, Nehru restored patronage of Deoband and Firangi Mahal, two very high-profile institutions of Islamic learning, and, quite randomly, a fine translation of the Quran, but not the no less prestigious Nadwa School of Islamic Learning in Lucknow. So there is a certain kind of randomness to his approach. And initially, his plan is to restore pensions and patronage in this kind of way only in India. But when the scale of the Nizam's overseas causes began to become clear, Indian embassies began to panic at the bad press that would follow if this funding too was cut. So much of that too was retained, but also once again in quite an ad hoc manner. So it was reactive rather than proactive. But Sherman is right in saying that it was a case-by-case approach that Nehru adopted. And that this went again against the grain of India's high policy elsewhere. It was highly individual, highly personal, emotional, and, dare I say it, princely. For instance, Nehru, together with Azad, collected 3.2 million rupees privately for relief. This was for Muslims. This was no part of the government of India's official relief package for Muslims, which did not exist. So do we see something going on here that is bigger than it seems? Are we seeing the subjects of Hyderabad push Nehru of Harrow and Trinity into behaving like a prince? Did their expectations that he had very wide discretionary powers actually encourage him to accrue such powers? Was this part of what his showdown with Sita Ramaya was all about? Perhaps it was. Perhaps the history of the Nehru dynasty has its roots not only in Allahabad, but also in Hyderabad. And now, of course, dynasties are everywhere, the aspiration of every party and political strongman, excluding the cadre-based parties of the extreme right and the extreme left. They include, of course, a great number of princes, princesses, and scions of political princely dynasties among them, as Anastasia Viliavsky's work also shows. Whether this too shows a degree of merging of forms is a complex question, and I don't think it can be addressed itself by me here today in this lecture. I don't believe it can be studied in isolation from the tradition of the family firm in South Asian commerce, or of artisan family household-based capitalism. But nonetheless, I think it's about time that historians paid serious attention to it. David, how much time do I have left?
A quarter of an hour.
Ah, good. Finally, there's one important form of pushback that is very significant for the development of India's nationhood. And this is the emergence of regional or ethnic nationalisms. I mentioned in a previous lecture that many of the states had already developed mythic resources grounded in regions and their tutelary deities or shrines. Without realizing it, in their haste to achieve Weberian bureaucratic efficiencies by bundling states into larger unions, the Indian states were setting into motion a process that would accentuate regional affiliations and naturalize a sense of regional belonging. Now, what do I mean by naturalize a sense of regional belonging? Let me tell you a little story, and just shows you what a fool I am. So you may enjoy it. When I arrived at Trinity, Cambridge, a long time ago, 2007, many of you perhaps, still babes in arms. I was having lunch with a colleague stroke friend, Peter Mandler. And as is the tradition at Cambridge, you kind of have lots of lunches. And he asked me, so where are you from? And unreflexively, I said, I'm from Bengal. And he said, so where's Bengal? So I explained to him, geographically speaking, where it was in India. And he said, so were you born there? I said, no. Did you go to school there? I said, no. Did you go to university there? I said, no. Did you marry somebody from there? I said, no. Was your child born there? No. I mean, did you spend your teenage years there? No. So where did you do all of this? I said, in Delhi. So he said, but what sense then are you from Bengal? I said, well, my father's ancestral home and, something like that. I don't know. I don't know why, but I am from Bengal. And but I continue to reflect on this question kind of at the back of my mind because I realized I was being a bit of an idiot. But I think all of us, every single of us, one of us Indians, now considers themselves, without thinking clearly, as belonging to a state. And I have a feeling that this process is a product of what happened in the 1950s. And what I'm going to argue now is that the princely states had a big part to play in that process. Hyderabad, you may not be surprised to find, was the first former state to witness a Sons of the Soil movement. The old language of Mulkis versus Ghair Mulkis, which had been alive in the time of the Nizam, was now resurrected in a new guise. J.N. Chaudhary's government had accepted the premise that Mulkis, people born in Hyderabad, that is Hindu Mulkis, Hindus born in Hyderabad, should be preferred in government employment. Muslims at this time were being sacked from their jobs in government, left, right, and center. So a new Mulki movement thus emerged in Telangana with a large number of Muslims in it. And this was a region already rife with huge cross-cutting social tensions. By 1952, a new Mulki uprising in Telangana, which included very large numbers of Muslims, which was crushed with the violence, which, dare I say it, had become banal in Hyderabad. But as Lisa Mitchell's superb work on the Telugu language movement shows, this did not bring matters to a tidy conclusion. In December of the same year, Potti Sri Ramalu starved himself in a fast to death to demand a separate province for Telugu speakers within India. And after this, despite Nehru's reluctance to create provinces on linguistic lines, the state of Andhra Pradesh, there was a huge amount of violence in and around Nellore, which led to the death of 4 people and the maiming of many, many others. And this led to the creation of the Andhra state in 1952. After this, language campaigns gathered momentum elsewhere in the subcontinent. Significantly, the next state where it became a very violent movement was in Maharashtra, in which the target of Mulki versus Ghair Mulki tensions was Marathas versus those people of the Saurashtra Union. So basically, people of the Saurashtra Union were people who spoke Gujarati, as I showed in that slide earlier. And people would go around, I mean, the Marathi-speaking people would go around and surround people and ask them what their mother tongue was. And if their mother tongue wasn't Marathi, they would beat the bejesus out of them. And so eventually you had the creation of separation of Maharashtra from Gujarat. In any event, this violence left over 80 people dead. So in consequence, in 1956, as part of a new compact, 6 new linguistic states were established, Maharashtra at the head of the list. By taking the total number of states to 13, India's States Reorganization Commission of 1956 thus tried to put a lid on the furies of language movements which everywhere challenged the government's drive to achieve a unitary nation state. But the lid soon blew off. Today, there are 29 states defined by region, the success of previous movements merely spurring on new demands. Now, these events raise fascinating questions. One is that has intrigued historians of post-colonial or transitional India, as it's known, for a while. How is it that language movements arose apparently from nowhere immediately after independence, And language became something that one used as one medium amongst others in a polyglot world, to being the primary marker of one's identity, the subject of intense and even fanatical devotion. How was it that even at a time when communal identities seemed to be defining themselves more sharply and more competitively against each other, language devotion appeared to transcend the growing schism between Hindus and Muslims? My humble proposition is that we at least consider, the fact that India's handling of the states and the attempt to suppress the regional identities that many of the states had come to represent are at least part of the answer. I just want to close my presentation with a couple of very fascinating slides. One is a response to one of the questions that came up last week. David, could we have the next slide, please? Okay, so this is a great one. Bart, have a look at it. This is one from the president of the All India States People's Berwa Mahasabha to address to Sardar Patel. The Berwa Mahasabha was a group of people who described themselves as chamars in the new state of Rajasthan. And this is a petition basically asking Patel to intervene in Rajasthan in the practices of the treatment of people of low caste, or what we would today call Dalits, and to remove the restrictions imposed against them, against the wearing of fine cloth, ornaments, and the eating of sweets, and also from begar. Now, I find this petition really fascinating. I mean, the intelligence of this person in writing about the very subjective notions of sympathy and justice that the rulers used. And surely these notions were very subjective. And the way he writes about it and asks for a rational approach instead is remarkable. It's really astonishing. But at the same time, the same person isn't aware that similar kinds of anti-Dalit activity is rife in other parts of India, which is not princely India and not part of the subjective notion of sympathy and princely sympathy and justice, and that the Indian state has no intention whatsoever of dealing with this. So this petition too falls on deaf ears. There are many petitions based on caste, particularly on artisan, by artisan caste. But this is from a Dalit caste. And the next one is, if we could have the last slide. Some of you may be aware of this. Nayanika, you perhaps have surely seen this. This is a petition from 1997. And the story is wonderful. This is by a young man called QADIR. And he climbs to the top of the telecommunications tower, which is closest to Rashtrapati Bhavan, which is, if you like, the Viceroy's palace. There's a horrible movie being made on it. And it looks like a palace because it was the Viceregal palace. And it's now the home of the President of India, who has no power, really. And he writes this letter. Now, it doesn't have the flowery opening of a typical petition, but it has the affect of a petition, and the kind of writing at any time of the day or year of a petition. And he tells the story of his love affair with his wife, with the person who became his wife, Priya. And they were, desperately in love. They eloped, they got married. Then they tried to persuade her parental family to agree to their marriage, but failed. David, can we move it forward? And then the family of Priya basically launched a reign of terror against his family, and they took Priya away from his life and warned him not to take any legal action and so on. So they basically launched kidnapping charges against him. Now, these are cases that we're very familiar with in India, but this is the first time I've come across a petition of this kind in one such case. They usually, end up in police thanas and so on. So what I'm asking you to consider is the fact that the petition, a form of intimate politics rich in ideas of subjecthood, remains an everyday practice of politics. Whether in Kamiar's petition or in Chamoli's residents marched to the district magistrate to do something about the big cat that was making their lives hell, that Nayanika Mathur has described with such vividness, it exists alongside voting within the carapace of democracy. Indeed, alongside voting, which happens once in a while, petitions can be submitted whenever the subject feels most aggrieved. These are different, mind you, from the flurry of writ petitions that Rohit Dey has described, which conform better to Anglo-Indian law and are submitted to the courts for action. These petitions go to the state's actors whom the writers perceive to have wider discretionary powers than that they are supposed to have. And perhaps this is one of the driving factors that makes state actors accrue more powers than they are supposed to have. So democratic and bureaucratic power in South Asia has often fractured when faced with them. I leave it to you to ponder why. I've thrown up some ideas, but as propositions rather than conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you, Joya. Thanks. That's very. Let me stop.
I'm glad I'm not Priya.
No, sorry. Don't know where that Freudian slip came from. I guess it's on it comes from the slide. Yeah. Let me unshare the slides. Make that mistake again. Thank you very much. So that was really, really fascinating, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I mean, let me just, while people are gathering their thoughts, I mean, I did a little bit of work on Yogi Adityanath some years back before he became chief minister, and as part of that, I and my collaborators, we visited his morning darbar, which is, so the language of subjecthood is still very much there, and the kind of manner in which poor people would approach him was requesting blankets or help with whatever. It was very much in that same idiom. But I suppose the question is, I mean, are we really going to say nothing has changed? I mean, how do we get in? Clearly, democratic values have spread nonetheless. In spite of the survival of these idioms of subjecthood. The values of democracy have spread into everyday life in a way that was I mean, quite unthinkable 100 years ago or whatever. So yes, I mean, the question is, how do we get that continuity and change into focus?
I guess, David, that's what I was trying to do in this lecture, to show continuity and change, to argue that 1947 is not as much of a break as we often think of it as being, and that to argue that this in terms of princely states, I mean, there's a big a huge kind of school of thought now about British India and the transitional state, which shows the extent to which there are many continuities across the colonial state to the post-colonial state in British India. But that has not been tracked for princely India. So what I'm trying to do basically is assess or unpick. I mean, this is early work. This is just, I'm floating ideas in this essay, in this concluding lecture, to say that perhaps this is showing us the ways in which the two ideas or the two types of ideas are being used at the same time. They're being interwoven. There's a use of different registers for different types of petition. People are using the petition at different moments and using the language of voting at different moments, that both forms of politics remain alive and well, and that that's how we have to think about it, perhaps, because otherwise we can't account for petitionary politics. And perhaps we even need to think of the writ petition in the context of the flurry of writ petitions that Rohit Dey talks about, not simply in terms of the Anglo-Indian law, but also in terms of states' justice. So I don't know. I'm just posing questions. I've not got hard answers. I'm asking the same questions that were asked about the transitional state, but about new parts of the subcontinent.
Okay, well, thank you. We've got suddenly a flurry of hands. Diwakar was first, so off you go, Diwakar.
Hello, thanks a lot for your interesting lecture. So you beautifully presented this overlapping identities, like your own identity as Bengali. So there, would you comment on Indianness as a cultural identity before and after, and what was the, I mean, where, in which level of consciousness these people who were moving from one mulk to another mulk, they were reconciling this Indianness as cultural identity, if it was there, and also they were speaking certain regional languages. This, though it was not formalized like later. So how it was negotiated and adjusted?
I mean, Diwakar, that's an excellent question. It's quite interesting that at least until the turn of the century, that's the beginning of the 20th century, no less a figure than Gandhi described the princely states as Indian India. So there was British India and there was Indian India. And, he actually, I mean, as we all know, he came from a state. He grew up in a different state. He had great experience of and connections with princes, which he used for refugee relief, as Uttara has shown. And so this language of Indian India was common, and this idea of the princes not being involved in Indian nationalism has also been blown apart. So they also have, I mean, I can be a Bengali and I can be a Indian and I can be a South Asian all at once, and Delhiite. I can do those things at once. They don't seem necessarily to settled identities. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Okay, so next on my list is Partashil. You want to unmute yourself?
Hi, Joya. That was really, really fun. I have two questions. The first one is about the fact that, there is a more general fascination, subaltern fascination with charismatic authority in, all parts of the world, partly motivated by aspiration, partly motivated by hope for betterment. One of such figures was Gandhi himself. What I'm thinking about is there a continuity in these various forms of charismatic authority, from princely figures to someone like Gandhi, to some other sort of peasant leaders or tribal leaders who might have, emerged with other forms of self-presentation? And is it a continuum that we are seeing here? And the second question is that, the contrast between princely petition as the petition of affect and colonial legacy petition as the petition of the rule of law. perhaps underestimates the fact that within the colonial setup, for instance, petition to a district collector or a magistrate, who was seen as a MyBAP figure in a particular area, would also be referred to with languages of affect. So and something that such officials would cultivate, as it were. There were different traditions within colonial governance of relating to the subjects. So one then wonders whether we can make that sharp distinction at all.
Thanks, Bart, as usual, for some deadly questions. Yes, I do agree with your general point about charismatic authority, the extent to which Gandhi is invested with charismatic authority, I think derives from many sources, though. It partly derives from the kind of charisma that is associated with his politics of affect, which is huge and which is therefore understood in a different way. But it's also understood, I think, I'm sorry, I'm very old-fashioned. I'm with Dumont on this, with his politics of renunciation and his refusal to take up after independence, because this is the period I'm talking about, his refusal to take up any offices of state. So this kind of a really powerful stand against of renunciation, which becomes, if you like, bigger and bigger as time passes, it does seem to be a part of the answer. But I think in terms of peasant resistance, a subaltern resistance, you do see it elsewhere. You do see it outside princely states. For instance, there's one example which immediately springs to mind, and that is of the Mappila uprising in southern India, where, as you perhaps know, I don't know if you know the details, in the Mappila region, which was partly a region dominated by Muslims who were probably many of Hadrami mixed origin, there was an uprising which started with the defacement of a sacred shrine, and it was believed that that shrine had been defaced by X or Y, and a conflagration spread by the police or whatever, and there was a huge 6-month-long insurgency. I mean, very few people in India, very few Indian historians even know how, I mean, the Mappila insurgency was probably the biggest. We know about Chauri Chaura. We don't know much about this insurgency. And during that insurgency, their first petition was to the Kingdom of Afghanistan to come and help them when they were being kind of like chased into the mountains by British forces. And then when the Kingdom of Afghanistan, Dost Muhammad Khan didn't come to help them and said, "Arey bhai, nahi hoga mere se." Then they began to speak about setting up a Khilafat kingdom of their own in that region. So again, you see this language in a part which is not part of princely India, speaking in the language of Khilafat kingdom. So it reoccurs, it comes up, it pops up. So why does it pop up so much? Now, I think we really have to take it seriously. We can't just pretend that princely India, it was all rubbish, and it's not worth thinking about. So this is what I'm trying to do. But great question, thank you.
Nandini, you're next.
There's another question. There's a second question. Do I have time, David?
Yeah, go ahead. Go for it. Go for it.
The petition of the rule of law and the rule of affect. Do the petitions that go, the writ petition, was that about?
It was about the local figures of the district collector and you know,
yeah.
people sort of
Yeah, no, of
looking
course,
at them
of
with
course, of
affect.
course. I mean, this is what I'm trying to say is that there's a tendency amongst petitioners to push people who they petition into taking more authority than they have, wider authority than they have. And so it's not just a matter that the district magistrate has this my Bap authority, but that he, like Nehru, is kind of, in a way, reactively responding to something. So we shouldn't always see it in a top-down way.
Nandini,
Thanks.
are you still there?
Yes.
Thanks, Joe. That was really fascinating. So if I've understood you correctly, you are arguing that there is an elective affinity for subjecthood, if you like, either because of the charismatic mode of leadership that Partha was alluding to, or because of a certain kind of benevolent cultivation of a benevolent patronage mode of engaging their subjects, or due to the charitable, humanitarian, philanthropic work they did, or the kind of ritual leadership that you were describing in relation to Ram Leela and Dashera and so on. You know, it could be a combination of these various things. So that's really the kind of crux of your argument, if I've understood it correctly. And I think that's a very powerful and very interesting argument. But I wonder what you think of a range of work by political scientists or political anthropologists who have noted this precise form of engaging with the Indian state, or, you know, various parts thereof, of this kind of petitioning mode. So starting with Professor Chatterji and his formulation of, you know, non-citizens, you know, effectively the political society is composed of denizens, and one of the ways in which they engage with the state is petitioning. Or Piliavsky arguing that patronage politics is the, you know, the crux of Indian politics. Or Lucia Michelotti talking about various kinds of Yadav leaderships and their kind of kingly mode of casting themselves. Or Indrajit Roy talking about the way affect is mobilized in politics. He talks about shaming and so on. So in a sense, these people are arguing that petitioning and the use of affect are a product of the Indian democratic system itself, which is structured by the ways in which party politics, formal politics, the state operates. Yeah. So it's less kind of bottom up in the way that you're arguing, some kind of elective affinity for subjecthood as being, you know, more legitimate or more responsive, but more top-down structuring of Indian democracy that has spawned this kind of politics. So I wonder how you would kind of react to that view.
You're right, Nandini, in saying that my view is more bottom up, and it's that my general argument is that that's something that was happening over a third of India in terms of its political traditions and its political engagements, which is in the form of petition, when the other part, 2/3 of India, actually had no political engagement, because, you know, representation, etc., comes in fairly late in British India, right? Elections, etc., come fairly late in British India. That it's not surprising that this mode of politics becomes something. I mean, because these guys would become Indians, they would move around, and this kind of politics would perhaps it certainly has long roots, and the fact that they don't get what they're looking for always, that it doesn't seem to put them off, because they do get what they're looking for sometime. It does work sometime, you know, as it worked with Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India. he gave them what they wanted some of the time, not most of the time, right? So I do think that I suggest that the state tended to be fairly reactive, particularly in the period in the first decade before the first elections. I mean, you know, the whole business of fighting elections on that scale was unseen anywhere else in the world. What could the state be but reactive? And therefore, if it reacts to affective modes of politics and affective registers of politics, it shouldn't necessarily surprise us. But these come from somewhere. It's not that each politician at that time is engendering. I mean, remember, these guys there were socialists, there were X, there were Y, there was Z, who were the party people at that time. Each one is not creating a language of affect by which he's approaching, or her. There are very few women then approaching the public. Yeah. So I don't know. I am in any case a bottom-up wali. So what to do? In the
Shantanu.
Oh, sorry. Hi.
Hi, sorry, I'm Shantanu, and I'm really sorry I missed the first two lectures. I should also admit that my subject is not history, it's English literature, so I may be coming from an angle. I found it fascinating, and I was just wondering, meaning that whether you are also arguing for this, for making a space for a history of emotions, maybe within the political sphere. And I wonder whether you maybe wanted to slightly distinguish this history of emotion from affect as not being produced by particular leaders, but having a much longer continuity, kind of change in continuity. And I have a more specific question. When you mentioned the question about language politics, I wonder whether is it just language, or language as a repository of a kind of certain emotional heritage. So two questions then, basically kind of history of emotions maybe, and the second about, the point about language being a signifier of something great.
Language, yeah. That's a really good question. I haven't really given the thought to the different register of affect and emotion. But I think both are at play. Often you see in the same petition many different registers at play. So affect can be at play, emotion can be at play, citizenship can be at play, subjecthood can be at play, democracy can be at play. So I think many things are going on, and what I probably need to work out more is teasing out the differences and pointing to them and pointing to the implications. So that's my failure. But there's a limit of time. The second question about language, you're absolutely right that these language movements there's so much going on. I mean, I just really don't even understand the Telangana movement with which it began. It's very hard to get sources on Hyderabad as a historian. I mean, how Taylor has done the work that she's done is just mind-boggling in the context. But it's very hard because most files are closed. But it would be remarkable to get sources on what was actually happening in Telangana, because it was crushed. It's so difficult to actually figure out what is happening, in whether it's how far it is people are using language as a means of overcoming other differences, particularly the Hindu-Muslim difference that is so powerful has become so powerful in Hyderabad, whereas previously it was not. Or whether something else more than that is going on. So I don't really know that what all goes on under the carapace of language. And I think, that's why I'm saying, please come forward, somebody, and take up these questions and help me, because it's too much for a lone scholar to answer all the questions. I'm just suggesting that these themes are linked, that there is a connection between the princely history and the language movements. There is a connection. It's not like two separate histories, the two areas of the subcontinent with, on two different islands, and then oops, they got joined, and then, things happened. I don't quite see it that way, if that is a sufficient answer.
Thank you very much. I can't kind of agree more with you, particularly on the first answer, that there's so many things happening at the same time, kind of this kind of mixed kind of emotions or mixed bag of feelings. So thank you.
That's a fascinating idea about the language movements being connected. And I see that Robert Frickenberg wants to come in. He's waving his hand side to side. So, Robert, do you want to? So apologies to those who are waiting in the queue.
Well, sorry.
Is it on this point?
I apologize for horning in at this point, but can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I want to thank Joya for this wonderful talk. It was a very instructive one, and I particularly appreciate the bottoms-up approach, and in a curious and interesting way, I have a kind of special emotional attachment to this, because I grew up in Hyderabad and in Telangana during the years before the big crash, and saw many of the things that you're talking about in action at the time. And I think that what's fascinating to me, and what you, I think, put your finger on here, is that the picture is so complex, and it's we're talking about a mosaic of traditional relationships that are ongoing, and in addition to the Mulki Telugu and the rivalry that there was with the coastal Andhra people, there's also the Urdu and the princely Urdu language and its culture, which survives and is very strong in Hyderabad to this day. So all of these things are at the same time, and one could see in the actual functioning of a first talukdar, which is the name of the district officer in Telangana, in Nalgonda, for example, where I grew up. I would see some of this in operation, the putting forward of the petitions and so forth, and the same sort of guesswork as to whether this petition would be heeded or not by the deity who was sitting on the throne, so to speak. So anyway, my question to you is, how does one knit together this great mosaic?
If only I knew, Bob, is my answer. I'm well, I think the first part of this, the first lecture, I have pretty much knit together the big picture of what was happening in terms of migrations and so on. The second, I have roughly got an idea of what was going on. But this lecture is really more a series of propositions about what is potentially happening. And this is the lecture in which I really need to work more and think more, because we really have very few sources. And certainly, I mean, I will have to look at many more sources in many different languages, which will mean I need a whole project, or I need several more PhD students to take up this work before I'm able to provide an adequate answer to that huge question. But it requires an answer. It's about time people turned their attention to it.
Here, I agree.
Thanks.